Welcome to the Roy Morgan Quarterly Update on Trust and Distrust for industries and brands right across the economy. And hasn't this been a week? Australia entered the 2022 election with unprecedented levels of distrust in the government, in politicians and in government services. And we saw a change in government and a change in the entire political landscape. The telco industry, our focus for today, is even more distrusted than the government. And while there's no election every 3 years in the telco industry, there are decisions made every day. It raises the question, who or what is telco's teal? But I'm jumping ahead. Trust really is the glue that holds relationships, both personal and business relationships, together. It means that we're able to create customer loyalty. Trust makes first-party data collection possible because people trust that it will be safe. It increases market cap, and increasingly it's recognised that trust is the cornerstone of a sustainable future. And trust accounts for about 75% of a brand's reputation. And that's not soft economics, that's hard market capitalisation. Just look at what Unilever CEO says about trust. He says trust is our most important value driver. And his market capitalisation was 130 billion euros, but the asset value was only 30 billion euros. The balance is made up by trust or reputation. That's a huge amount. Now, pretty much everyone measures trust and Net Promoter Score and customer satisfaction, but only Roy Morgan measures distrust. And it's distrust where our deepest fears, pain and betrayal surface. The shock or disappointment of discovering we were foolish to trust too much. That's where all the real pain is. Distrust starts with doubt and suspicion, and it quickly accelerates to fear and then action. This is when customers desert a brand. Again, AMP is the perfect case study. And again, the political parallels are extraordinary. And it's not just AMP. Facebook, Johnson & Johnson and Rio Tinto are all examples of companies whose market value, revenue and leaderships have been materially impacted by brand shock and deep distrust. So how do we measure trust and distrust? Well, unsurprisingly, we do a survey. And Roy Morgan is in our 5th year of asking 1,000 Australians each and every month which brands they trust and which brands they distrust. We also ask them why, in their own words, they trust the brands they nominate and why, in their own words, they distrust the brands they nominate. And believe me, they tell us some very interesting things. And of course, that's what our clients get the greatest value from, getting under the bonnet to see where they're getting it right and being recognised by their customers and non-customers, or where they're getting it terribly wrong and risking real damage to their brand. So the research is open-ended and unprompted, so that if a brand is mentioned as a trusted brand or a distrusted brand, it means that it's so top of mind for people that they put it right on top, ahead of all the other brands, swirling around in their consciousness. It's real. So let's look at the trust winners and the trust losers in this March quarter. First, looking at industry sectors, supermarkets just keep dominating trust. It all started when they stepped up during COVID, and as a sector, it hasn't really missed a beat since then. On the dark side of the coin, down there on the red, we actually see social media, which continues to attract really toxic levels of distrust from Australians. Banks, and importantly for this session, telcos, join social media as the most distrusted sectors, even more distrusted than the government and government services. So let's take a look at specific brands. First, we look at those brands with a net trust score, more trusted than distrusted. There are the supermarket powerhouses, Woolworths and Coles, still in 1st and 2nd place as Australia's most trusted brands. Interestingly, Coles is losing ground to Woolworths as the gap between them widens. Apple is the big winner, jumping 6 places with the 9th highest net trust score. Importantly, while Apple has a lot of trust, 3rd in actual trust, even beating the really perennially trusted Bunnings, it isn't right up there in third place. And that's because Apple has a dark side. Its pure distrust score is the highest of any on this screen, and that's what pulls it down to number 9. For all that, it's still the biggest improver. And NRMA is the biggest loser, slipping 4 rankings to 12th spot. Now Australia's most distrusted brands, where distrust outweighs trust. While the 5 most distrusted brands remain unchanged, Facebook, Telstra, Amazon, Google and News Corp, there was movement among the other brands. AGL is the biggest loser in this quarter's net distrust score rankings, jumping 15 places into the 19th spot. And Australians who nominate AGL as their distrusted brand accuse it of being too motivated by profit, not customer focused, and importantly for Mike Cannon-Brookes' strategy to acquire AGL, respondents believe the company is environmentally irresponsible. Shell's increasing distrust is another example of its reputation as an environmentally irresponsible brand, impacting not only its petrochemical business, but also an Australian premium energy retailer, PowerShop, acquired by Shell earlier this year. We predict, and we've actually seen the early evidence, but we predict that the socially progressive customers who were so attracted to PowerShop's environmental credentials, making it a startup darling of the market, will desert it in droves following the Shell acquisition. Harvey Norman's dramatic fall from grace in the distrust stakes continues. But in the winner's circle, NAB continues as the big improver. It's the only one of the big 4 banks to move out of the top 20 most distrusted brands in Australia. That's why it's not in this chart. So let's look at what Australians say about AGL. Basically, they're ready to ruin the environment for immediate financial gains, bad customer service, only concerned with lining their pockets and exorbitant fees. Pretty strong. And how about Shell? Unjustified fuel price gouging. They're a cartel and they fix prices. They pillage the environment while covering themselves in the banner of helping people. And somebody who feels really strongly about it said they're a lying, fossil fuel burning company that cares about profits over people or the planet. Strong words. Now let's move then into the promised deep dive into the telecommunications sector. Commoditisation, coupled with increasing complexity, is a real present threat in the telecommunications industry, as are dramatically increasing consumer demands and expectations. And these things are all being played out within an environment of deep distrust. For the 3rd year in a row, telecommunications is placed 24th in the industry rankings, or 3rd from the bottom. And the telcos' decline, if we look at that red line, into ever greater distrust began really in early 2020. Customer service and affordability are the leading reasons for that deterioration. And while the banks, that's the yellow line, have bounced back, the telco sector has reached new lows. Now, apart from what people say, we also look at distrust score, the net distrust score, and what's driving it. And what we see here, the net distrust score is driven by increasing distrust, the red bars, and an even greater loss of trust. So it's both sides of the coin. And change in this industry is most noticeable in specific demographics, including among women and those in the 50 to 64 age group. Now let's look at some individual brands in this telecommunications sector. And the winners are Aussie Broadband and iiNet. In fact, they're the only 2 telco brands in positive trust territory. Vodafone and TPG are neutral. That means distrust is pretty much at the same level as their trust. And Telstra, as already mentioned, is the most distrusted. Now, it's interesting to look at Telstra's financial performance, given this net distrust score ranking. And we see that since 2015, Telstra's share price has bounced around, but has more than halved during that time. Now, that can't be attributed solely to its dramatic level of distrust, but neither can it be said that despite deep levels of distrust, Telstra is still performing well. Telstra's net distrust score has a huge impact on the overall industry results. So Telstra there in blue has always been well below that of the other key telco brands, but the gap in March 2022 is at near record levels after deteriorating during 2021. So if we remove Telstra from the chart, the differences between the other telco companies are revealed. And Huawei remains distrusted with extremely little trust, and Huawei is the red line. We see Vodafone has moved into neutral territory with increasing levels of both trust and distrust, keeping its net score at 0. But the most trusted telecommunication brand is Aussie Broadband. Telstra aspires to be a trusted brand, and yet the gap between aspiration and reality remains stubbornly wide. And when we look more closely, we see that Telstra's pure trust levels, the green bars, have remained relatively steady in recent months, but more distrust nominations have seen its net distrust score deteriorate, and this is the real danger space. Interestingly, Telstra's net distrust score, their distrust, is worse in regional Australia than it is in metropolitan areas. And Telstra's high levels of distrust are also reflected in the level of complaints about it to the Telecommunication Ombudsman Office. You see on this chart, for Optus and Vodafone, complaints run pretty much in line with market share. However, for Telstra, their share of complaints is much higher than you'd expect just based on its market share. And the reason that people dislike Telstra or distrust Telstra: poor customer service, hard to get issues resolved, useless customer service and problem-solving capabilities, the same thing, a history of ripping customers off. But we also have people who feel really, really strongly, and people are saying things like Telstra's blatantly unlawful and unaccountable for its improper actions. They say, I've observed the company maintain no face to the public so it can operate beyond the law. The worst company in Australia to deal with. So these are really, really angry words. When we look then at Optus, the gap between Optus's trust aspirations and its distrust is really small. That said, Optus still needs to reduce its distrust before it starts building trust, really strong levels of trust in its brand. Optus has also seen a rising level of distrust, not nearly as strong as some of the other brands in our survey, but we're seeing it causing its net distrust score to deteriorate. Optus is also less distrusted in metropolitan Australia than in regional Australia. If we look at how people feel about Optus, we see their sales tactics are predatory, they can't fix basic issues and overcharge for poor quality, terrible customer service, profits over people. But we don't see the anger that was directed at Telstra. We don't see the venomous comments coming through for Optus. I'm now going to ask social scientist Dr Ross Honeywill to take a look at the risks and rewards on offer in the telco space. Over to you, Ross.
Thanks, Michele. Now first, a couple of definitions. MNO means Mobile Network Operator. Australia has 3 of these MNOs, and they're Telstra, Optus and Vodafone. Vodafone's owned by TPG. These are the companies that own their own networks and infrastructure. The other term is MVNO, and that means Mobile Virtual Network Operator. They lease phone and data services from one of the big 3 networks. They don't have their own infrastructure. An example of this class are Aussie Broadband, iiNet, Primus, Dodo, and a whole range of others that we're all familiar with. So let's have a look at the data. At the risk of political overreach, on Saturday, we saw Australians desert the major parties for independence and the Greens. Now, this rebellion against the majors may go well beyond politics. According to Roy Morgan data, when Australians switch their home and mobile internet provider, they're more likely to leave one of the big 3 MNOs to go to a much smaller MVNO. Look at the box on the right. Of all the people who switched in the past 12 months, only 40% went to one of the big 3. But the smaller MVNOs like Aussie Broadband got 60% of the switches. Now, recall that only Aussie Broadband and iiNet have a net trust score, while Telstra and Optus have net distrust scores. So the small are more trusted and the big are less trusted or more distrusted. And Australians are attracted to a brand they trust, and they're more prepared to switch from a brand they distrust. Anthony Albanese, to extend the analogy, is the most trusted political leader in Australia, and Scott Morrison is the most distrusted politician in any Australian parliament. So Australians trusted and were attracted to Albanese and the other trusted independents and Teals and Greens, and they switched from the deeply distrusted brand ScoMo. Distrust, therefore, poses a significant potential threat to the big Australian MNOs. Aussie Broadband, as we've heard, is the most trusted telco, and it's one of the fastest growing. It uses NBN to offer high-speed broadband and the Optus network for 4G and high-speed 5G mobile. Now, one reason why it's so trusted is that Aussie Broadband, it's a lot like the supermarket brand Aldi. What they put on the can is what you get. Uncomplicated, transparent, and authentic. However, while it has virtually no distrust, Aussie Broadband's declining trust poses a risk issue for MD Philip Britt and his board to get on top of and fix. Remember what Michele said earlier, trust accounts for around 75% of a brand's reputation. And what the Unilever CEO said, 3/4 of our market capitalisation is trust and reputation. But there's more news about why the two trusted smaller brands without any infrastructure, Aussie Broadband and iiNet, are being so successful in taking business away from the big MNOs with all their networks. Both brands are also in the top 2 premium brands in the telco sector. Now, a premium brand at its simplest level is one which is chosen by premium consumers. And premiumisation is the antidote to commoditisation. Every year, in partnership with Roy Morgan, we analyse the brand preferences of the highest value Australians in Roy Morgan's extraordinary single source consumer database. I consider it the best in the world, to rank the top premium brands in a range of industry sectors. Now, these premium or neo consumers earn more, spend more, and spend more frequently than anyone else in the economy. And super neos are the top 50% of neos, and they love Aussie Broadband. We call the top 50% of neos super neos because they represent super value potential. There are 2.5 million of them in Australia, and they're relatively more likely to be with Aussie and iiNet, the top 2 premium brands, than any other mobile service provider. And they're also more likely than anyone else to have Aussie Broadband as their home broadband provider. Now, these super neos are harder to please and much more demanding. The reason I'm raising them here is because the premium brand analysis and ranking is based on their behaviour. And as future shapers, they set high standards that satisfy others too, that others come along because they shape the future. They love and trust Aussie, and that means profitable growth potential. Now, of the MNOs, the big 3, Vodafone's neo customers are more likely to trust it than its average customers do. This has the potential to deliver commercial value to Vodafone. Conversely, however, Telstra and Optus's neo customers distrust them more than their average customers do. Now, this doesn't augur well for their future capacity to premiumise for profitable growth. However, for Optus, its premium ranking and relatively small net distrust score give it the potential to reverse the trend of the high-value customers deserting it for the smaller MVNOs like Aussie Broadband. So now back to Michele.
Thank you, Ross. So that brings this webinar to a close. But before we go, can we suggest you subscribe to the Roy Morgan YouTube channel so you can see these webinars and so much more in your own time. And finally, thank you to David Laffin, Head of the Roy Morgan Risk Lab, to Adam Ray and Tom Mullins for number crunching and analysis. I look forward to catching up with you again on the 30th of June for our end of financial year analysis and our predictions for the business year ahead. See you then.